When the next night arrived, however, Scheherazade received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "Listen carefully," Aladdin said to his wife. "I want you to get dressed in your very best garments and cast off all show of melancholy. In addition, when the accursed Moor comes to visit you, you're to welcome him and greet him with a smiling face and invite him to dine with you. Make him think that you've forgotten Aladdin, your beloved, and your father as well, and that you've fallen tremendously in love with him. At one point, you have to ask for some wine. Make sure that it's red, and pledge yourself to him. After you've given him 2 or 3 cups full, and he's grown careless, you're to drop this powder into his cup and fill it with wine. As soon as he drinks it, he'll fall down senseless, as though he were dead." "It will be very difficult for me to do all this," said the princess. "However, I know I must do it if we're to escape this vile magician who's tormented me by this abduction. It's both lawful and right to kill this villain." Then Aladdin ate and drank with his wife to placate his hunger, and immediately afterward he left the pavilion. Then the lady Badar al-Budar summoned her slave girls, who dressed her in her finest raiment, adorned her, and sprayed her with perfume. Just as they were finished, the Moor entered her apartment, and he was most pleased to see her in this condition, and even more when, contrary to her former behavior, she greeted him with a smiling face. All this made his love and lust for her increase. Then she took him by his hand, and seating him beside her, said, "My darling, if you are willing, I would like you to come and dine with me tonight. I have mourned." "My darling, if you are willing, I would like you to come and dine with me tonight. I have mourned long enough, and even if I continue to do so for 1,000 or 2,000 years, Aladdin could not return to me from the tomb. For I believe what you said yesterday, that my father had him slain in sorrow over the separation from me. So you needn't wonder why I've changed so much from one day to the next. I have thought about everything and decided to accept you as my friend and lover, and as Aladdin's successor, especially since I have no other man except you. Therefore, I want you to dine with me tonight, and we can drink wine and enjoy each other's company. I'd particularly like to taste some of your African wine, since I've heard that it is much better than the wine we drink in China." Although Lady Badar al-Budar's change was sudden, she managed to convince the Moor that she had abandoned all hope of seeing Aladdin, and in his ecstasy he said, "Your wish is my command, my lady. I have a cask of our native wine at home that I've carefully kept stored deep in the ground for 8 years, and I'll go now and fetch whatever we shall need and return to you as soon as I can." But since the princess wanted to tease him and excite him even more, she said, "My darling, don't leave me alone. Send one of your eunuchs to fetch the wine. Remain seated next to me so that I may enjoy your company." "My lady," he replied, "nobody knows where the cask is buried except me, and I won't be away too long." After saying this, the Moor left, and after a short time he brought back as much wine as they needed. Thereupon the princess said to him, "You've gone to great pains to please me, my beloved, and I apologize." "Not at all, my dearest," said the Moor. "It is an honor to serve you." The lady Badar al-Budar sat down at the table with them, and they began eating. Soon the princess requested the wine, and a slave girl filled her cup, and then the Moor's. So she drank to his long life and his secret wishes, and he also drank to her life. Since the princess had a great gift in making eloquent speeches, she began to make all sorts of toasts to him and beguiled him by addressing him in the sweetest terms full of hidden meaning. Unable to see through her deception, the Moor thought that her actions resulted from her true inclination for him and did not suspect that she was setting a trap. So his longing for her increased, and out of love for her, his head began to swim, and the world seemed as if it were nothing in his eyes. When they came to the end of the dinner, and the wine had gotten the better of him, the princess realized that she had him at her mercy, and said, "There is a custom in our country, but I don't know whether you do the same thing in yours." "What is it?" asked the Moor. So she said to him, "At the end of dinner, each lover takes the cup of the other beloved and drinks it." Thereupon she took his cup and filled it with wine for herself. Then she poured the wine into hers, mixed with the drug, and asked a slave girl to give it to him. Now she had instructed the slave girl what she was to do, and all the slave girls and eunuchs in the pavilion longed for the sorcerer's death and supported the princess's plan. Accordingly, the slave girl handed him the cup, and when he saw the princess drinking from his cup, and was taken in by her show of love, he imagined he was Iskandar, Lord of the Two Horns. Then she leaned over to him, swaying to and fro, put her hand within his hand, and said, "Oh, my life, your cup is with me, and mine with you, and this is the way that lovers drink from each other's cups." Then she kissed the brim, drained his cup, and then kissed the brim of her own cup for him to drink. By now he was delirious, and he wanted to follow her example. He kissed the brim, raised the cup to her, and then drank the contents down without worrying whether there was anything harmful in it. And immediately thereafter he rolled over on his back as though he were dead, and the cup dropped from his hand. Right then and there, the slave girls ran hurriedly to the secret door and opened it for their lord Aladdin, who was still disguised as a peasant. He ran up to his wife's apartment and found her still sitting at the table and facing the drugged Moor. At once he approached her, kissed her, and thanked her for all that she had done. Overjoyed by what had taken place, he said, "Please withdraw your slave girls to the inner chamber and leave me alone for a while, so that I may think about what I have to do." The princess went away at once with her slave girls, and Aladdin locked the door behind them. Then he walked up to the Moor, stuck his hand into the magician's breast pocket, and drew out the lamp. After doing this, he unsheathed his sword and slew the villain. Then he rubbed the lamp, and immediately the genie appeared and said, "At your service, my lord. What is it you want?" "I want you to take my pavilion and transport it to China," replied Aladdin. "You are to set it down on the spot where it was standing before." "As you command, my lord," said the married. Then Aladdin went to his wife, and throwing his arms around her, he kissed her, and she kissed him, and they sat in conversation while the genie transported the pavilion and all its contents to the designated place. Soon Aladdin ordered the slave girls to set the table, and he and the Lady Badar al-Budar began eating and drinking with great joy until they had contented themselves. Thereafter they withdrew to the drinking room, where they caroused and kissed each other. It had been a long time since they had been able to enjoy each other, and they continued to do so until the wine rose in their heads and sleep got the better of them. Early the next morning, Aladdin awoke and woke his wife. Then the slave girls entered and helped her get dressed, while Aladdin donned his finest raiment. The two were ecstatic about their reunion, and the princess was especially joyous and glad that day because she expected to see her beloved father. So much for Aladdin and his wife. the Lady Badar al-Buda. Now, let us return to the Sultan. After he had driven away his son-in-law, he kept mourning the loss of his daughter, and every hour of every day he would sit and weep for her as women weep because she was his one and only child. And as soon as he shook off sleep morning after morning, he would rush to the window, throw it open, and peer in the direction of Aladdin's pavilion. Then tears would stream from his eyes until his lids were red and sore. Now, on that particular day, he arose at dawn, and according to his custom, he looked out and suddenly saw a building. So he rubbed his eyes and kept looking at it curiously until he was certain that it was his son-in-law's pavilion. So he called for a horse right away, and as soon as the steed was saddled, he mounted and headed for the pavilion. When Aladdin saw his father-in-law approaching, he went down and met him halfway. Then, taking him by the hand, he helped the Sultan upstairs to his daughter's apartment. Anxious to see her father, the princess had descended and greeted him at the door of the staircase facing the ground floor hall. Thereupon, the king hugged her in his arms and kissed her, shedding tears of joy, and she did likewise, until Aladdin finally led them to the upper salon, where they took seats, and the Sultan began asking her all about what had happened. "My father," she began, "I only regained my life yesterday when I saw my husband, and it was he who set me free from a vile magician. I don't believe that there is a more treacherous man on earth than this Moor. If it had not been for my beloved, I would never have escaped him, nor would you ever have seen me again. I had been deeply grieved because I had lost you, and also my husband, to whom I shall be grateful for the rest of my life for freeing me from that wicked sorcerer." Then the princess related everything that had happened to her, how the Moor had tricked her in the disguise of a lamp seller, how she had given him the magic lamp, and how she had laughed at the Moor when she exchanged the old lamp for the new one, how she had been transported in the pavilion to Africa, and how Aladdin had freed them with the help of the potent drug. In turn, Aladdin recounted how he had slaughtered the wizard when he had found him dead drunk, how he had taken the lamp from the sorcerer's breast pocket, and how he had ordered the genie to transport the pavilion back to its proper site, ending his tale with, "And if your highness has any doubt about our story, come with me and take a look at the accursed magician." Accordingly, the king went with Aladdin, and after looking at the Moor, he ordered the corpse to be carried away and burned, and its ashes scattered in the air. Then he embraced Aladdin and said, "Pardon me, my son. Indeed, I was on the verge of taking your life because of the foul deeds of this damned wizard who put you in a dangerous situation. You must excuse me for what I did, because I was deeply upset about my daughter, my only child, who is dearer to me than my kingdom. You must know the great love parents bear for their offspring." "Your Majesty," Aladdin replied, "you did nothing that went against holy law, and likewise I did not sin against you. The entire trouble was caused by that Moor, the unholy magician." Thereupon, the Sultan ordered the city to be decorated and commanded the herald to announce, "This day is a great holiday. There will be public celebrations for 1 month in honor of the return of Lady Badar al-Budar and her husband Aladdin." And the people obeyed and held banquets and feasts throughout the city, and that was the end of Aladdin's troubles with the Moor. However, even though the magician's body had been burned and his ashes scattered in the air, the villain had a brother, even more vile than he was, and even more adept in necromancy, geomancy, and astrology. As the saying goes, they were like two peas from the same pod, and when the pod was split, Each dwelled in his own part of the globe and practiced sorcery, fraud, and treachery. Now, one day it so happened that the Moor's brother learned what had happened to him through his geomantic sandboard. After grieving a while, he cast the sand a second time to learn how his brother had died and where. This was how he discovered that the site was Africa, and that his brother had been killed by a man called Aladdin, who was now living in China. Once this sorcerer had gathered all this information, he arose right away and equipped himself for the voyage to China. After he had traveled through wilderness and over mountains and plains for many months, he reached China and the city where he hoped to find his brother's murderer. He took lodging at the inn for foreigners, and after resting in his room for a while, he went out and wandered about the streets contemplating a way to avenge his brother's death. Soon he entered a coffee house, a fine building which stood in the marketplace and which attracted many people to play at dice, backgammon, chess, and other games. There he sat down and listened to those seated next to him, and they happened to be speaking about a holy woman named Fatima, who lived outside the town in a cell where she practiced her devotions. She entered the city only 2 days each month, and according to the people who were talking, she had performed many holy miracles to help those in need. "This is exactly what I was looking for," said the Moorish sorcerer to himself. "God willing, I'll be able to carry out my plans with the help of this old woman." Then the magician turned to the people who were talking about the miracles performed by the devout old woman and said to one of them, "Friend, I heard you talking about the virtues of a certain holy woman named Fatima. Could you tell me who she is and where she lives?" "Remarkable!" exclaimed the man. "How come you've never heard about the miracles of the Lady Fatima? Evidently you must be a stranger if you know nothing about her devout fasts, her asceticism, and her beautiful piety." "It is true, my lord," replied the Moor. "Yes, I am a stranger, and I arrived in your city only last night. And now I hope that you will tell me about the holy miracles of this virtuous woman and where she lives, for I've suffered a terrible calamity, and I'd like to visit her and request that she pray for me, so that Allah may deliver me from evil through her blessing." In response, the man recounted the marvels of the holy Fatima, her piety and devout life. Then, taking him by the hand, he led him outside the city and showed him the way to her abode, a cave on the top of a hill. The magician thanked him for showing him the place and returned to his khan. Now, as fate would have it, Fatima came down to the city the very next day, and the Moor happened to leave his khan early the next morning and encounter crowds of people. Since he was curious about what was going on, he went and saw the holy woman standing in the middle of a throng of people, and anyone who suffered from pain or sickness went up to her and solicited a blessing and prayer. Indeed, each and every one she touched was instantly cured from his illness. The sorcerer followed her about the city until she returned to her dwelling. Then he walked back to his khan and waited until evening, when he drank a cup of wine at a tavern. After this, he left the city and went straight to the holy woman's cave. After entering it, he saw her lying prostrate with her back on a strip of matting. So he moved forward, sat down on her stomach, drew his dagger, and began shouting at her. When she opened her eyes, she was terrified to find a Moor sitting on her belly with a dagger in his hand about to kill her. However, he said to her, "Don't utter a word. If you do, I'll slay you right this second. Now Get up and do everything I tell you to do." Then he swore to her that if she obeyed his orders, no matter what they were, he would not kill her. After saying this, he got off her stomach and stood up, and Fatima did likewise. "Give me your dress," he said, "and take my garments." So she gave him her headdress, veil, and mantilla. Then he said, "You must also use some ointment on me, so that my face becomes the same color as yours." Accordingly, she went to the back of the cave and brought out a jar of ointment, spread some of it on her palm, and smeared his face until it looked like hers. Then she hung her rosary around his neck, gave him her staff, and showed him how to walk and what to do when he entered the city. Finally, she handed him a mirror and said, "Now you look just like me." When he gazed into the mirror, he appeared as though he were Fatima herself. But when he had accomplished what he had wanted, he broke his word and asked for a piece of rope, which he used to strangle her. When she was dead, he hauled the corpse outside and threw it into a nearby pit. Then he went back to sleep in her cave, and when dawn arrived the next day, he went into the town and took a place under the walls of Aladdin's pavilion. Gradually, the people began flocking to him, certain that he was the holy Fatima. And he did what she usually did. He placed his hands on those in pain and recited verses from the Koran. Soon the clamoring of the crowd was heard by the Lady Badar al-Budar, who said to her slave girls, "Find out what's causing all that noise." So the chief eunuch went out to see what the matter was, and soon returned to his mistress and said, "My lady, the commotion is being caused by the Lady Fatima, and if you wish, I'll bring her to you so that you may obtain a blessing from her." "Go and fetch her," said the princess. "I've heard about her miracles and virtues for some time now, and I'd very much like to meet her and get a blessing from her." The eunuch went out and brought in the Moor disguised in Fatima's clothing. When the magician stood before the Lady Badar al-Budar, he began to bless her right away with a string of prayers. Everyone was completely convinced that it was the holy woman herself. So the princess arose and saluted him and had him take a seat by her side. "My Lady Fatima," she said, "it would be an honor if you would always stay here so that I could receive your blessings and learn how to follow your pious and good example." Though this invitation was exactly what he had wanted, the sorcerer felt it would be best for the deception if he played hard to get. So he replied, "My lady, I'm a poor religious woman who dwells in a cave. People like myself are not fit to live in the palaces of kings." But the princess replied, "Don't you worry in the least. I'll give you a separate apartment in the pavilion, and you'll be able to worship as you please. Nobody will disturb you, and it will be a better place to pray to Allah than your cave." "As you wish, my lady," said the Moor. "I'll accept your offer, for the commands of royalty are not to be opposed. My only wish is that I may be able to eat, drink, and sit in my own chamber that will be entirely private. I don't desire anything special except a bit of bread and some water that one of your slave girls could perhaps carry to me every day. If I happen to need food, I would prefer to eat it in my own room." Of course, the reason the accursed magician said all that was to avert discovery at meal times when he would have had to raise his kerchief, and his beard and mustache would have given him away. "Oh, Lady Fatima," the princess replied, "there is nothing to worry about. Everything will be just as you desire. Now please rise so that I can show you the apartment. Lady Badar al-Budar conducted the sorcerer to a separate apartment in the pavilion that she had kindly promised him for a home. Then she said, Lady Fatima, you can have your privacy here and live in comfort, and we shall name this place after you. The Moor acknowledged her kindness and prayed for her. Then the princess showed him the jeweled dome with its 24 windows and asked him what he thought of the marvelous pavilion. By Allah, my daughter, said the magician, it is wonderful, and there's probably nothing like it in the entire universe. However, it appears to be lacking one thing that would enhance its beauty. What is it? Asked the princess. Please tell me, for I want it to be absolutely perfect. The only thing it needs, said the Moor, is the egg of the bird ruck hanging from the middle of the dome. If this were done, there would be absolutely nothing like this pavilion in the world. What is this bird? The princess asked. Where can we find her egg? My lady, the ruck is a gigantic bird, the sorcerer replied. It is so powerful that it can carry off camels and elephants in its claws. It is found mainly on Mount Kaf, and the architect who built this pavilion is capable of bringing you one of its eggs. Then they stopped their conversation, since it was noontime, and when the servants set the table, the Lady Badar al-Budar invited the accursed Moor to eat with her. But he refused, and the princess had his meal carried to his room, where he ate by himself. Now, when it turned evening, Aladdin returned from the hunt and greeted his wife by embracing and kissing her. However, when he looked her in the face, he noticed that she was somewhat sad and did not smile. So he asked her, Has anything happened to you, my darling? Tell me what's troubling you. Nothing whatsoever, she replied. But, my beloved, I had thought that our pavilion was absolutely perfect and did not lack a thing, but that is not entirely the case, Aladdin. I think that if there were a ruck's egg that hung from the jeweled dome, there would be nothing like it in the universe. Is this all that's been bothering you? Aladdin asked. It's the easiest thing in the world for me to fix. So cheer up. All you have to do is tell me when you want something, and I'll fetch it instantly, even if it's hidden in the bowels of the earth. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, After making sure that his wife had regained her good spirits, Aladdin withdrew to his chamber, where he took the lamp and rubbed it. Immediately the genie appeared and said, Ask whatever you want. I want you to fetch me the egg of the bird ruck, Aladdin replied, and I want you to hang it from the dome of my pavilion. But when the Marid heard these words, his face became fierce, and he shouted with a mighty and frightful voice, You ungrateful soul! Isn't it enough that I and all the slaves of the lamp are always at your service? Yet now you also demand that I bring you our mistress just for your pleasure, and hang her up in the dome of the pavilion for the enjoyment of you and your wife. By Allah, you and she deserve to be reduced to ashes this very moment and to be scattered in the air. But since you two are not aware of the crime you have committed and its consequences, I'll pardon you. Innocent as you are, you can't help what you've done. The crime is due to that sorcerer, the brother of the Moorish magician who is living here and pretending to be the holy Fatima. He put on her clothes and disguised himself as her after murder. and disguised himself as her after murdering her in her cave. Indeed, he came here to kill you out of revenge for his brother, and it is he who persuaded your wife to make this request to me." After saying all this, the genie vanished. Yet Aladdin was still trembling after hearing the marriage shout at him, and he felt completely bewildered. But gradually he recovered his senses and went into his wife's apartment. There he pretended to have a headache, for he knew how famous Fatima was for healing all sorts of pains like that. When the lady Badar al-Budar saw him sitting with his hand on his head and complaining about the pain, she asked him what the matter was, and he replied, "I don't know why, but I've got a terrible ache in my head." Thereupon, she ordered that the holy Fatima be summoned immediately so that she could put her hand on his head. "Who is this Fatima?" Aladdin asked. So she informed him that it was the holy Fatima, for whom she had provided a home in the pavilion. Meanwhile, a slave girl had gone to fetch the accursed Moor, and when the villain appeared, Aladdin stood up and, acting as though he knew nothing about the magician's deception, he saluted him as though he were the real Fatima. He kissed the hem of his sleeve, welcomed him, and treated him with honor. "My lady Fatima," Aladdin said, "I would appreciate it if you would do me a favor. I am well aware that you are adept at curing pains, and I am now suffering from a terrible headache." The accursed Moor could hardly believe his ears, since this was exactly what he had wanted. So he approached Aladdin to place his hand upon his head and heal his ache. As he did this, the other hand was under his gown, holding a dagger and ready to kill him. But Aladdin was watching him carefully and waited patiently until the Moor revealed the dagger. Then, with a powerful grip, he wrenched the dagger from his grasp and plunged it deep into his heart. When the lady Badar al-Budar saw him do this, she shrieked, "Why have you shed this holy woman's blood? Have you no fear of Allah? Don't you know that the holy Fatima's miracles are known throughout the world?" "But I haven't killed Fatima," Aladdin replied. "I've only killed Fatima's murderer, the brother of that vile Moor who abducted you through his magic and transported my pavilion to Africa. His damned brother came to our city and planned our downfall. He murdered Fatima and assumed her identity in order to avenge his brother's death. If you don't believe me, come over here and take a look at the person I've slain." Thereupon, Aladdin drew the Moor's veil aside, and the lady Badar al-Budar saw a man with a full beard. Realizing that her husband was telling the truth, she said, "My beloved, this is the second time that I've placed your life in danger." "No harm's been done," replied Aladdin. "Besides, your eyes are blessing enough for all the risks I've taken, and I'll joyfully take on anything that comes with being married to you." Hearing these words, the princess embraced him and said, "My darling, I can't believe you've done all this out of your love for me. I never knew how much you loved me, but don't think that I take your affection for granted." So Aladdin kissed her and held her close, and they could feel their love for each other growing stronger. Now, just at that moment, the Sultan appeared, and they told him about everything that had happened and showed him the corpse of the sorcerer. Consequently, the king commanded the body to be burned and the ashes to be scattered in the air, just as he had done with the wizard's brother. Thereafter, Aladdin lived with his wife, the lady Badar al-Budar, in happiness and joy, and he survived all the dangers that he later encountered. After a while, when the Sultan died, Aladdin ascended the throne. During his reign, he treated his subjects with justice and wisdom so that everyone loved him, and he lived with his wife in bliss and serenity until the destroyer of delights and the severer of societies came and visited him. No sooner had Scheherazade concluded her tale than she said, "And yet, O king, this tale is no more wondrous than the remarkable story of Jonah the mermaid and her son Badar Bezam of Persia.